The first collapse of empire. Between 2450 and 2184 BC, the excesses of the pharaohs trouble the people of Egypt, and the Old Kingdom ends. Meanwhile, Egypt was suffering from the opposite problem: too many personalities, all of them wanting to be remembered forever. Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid, was succeeded first by his eldest son, who didn't reign long enough to build anything in particular, and then by his next son, Khafra. Khafra ruled for 66 years according to Manetho and 56 by Herodotus's count. 40. Either way, he kept the throne for a very long time. Khafre, Herodotus tells us, carried on in the same manner as his father. Like Khufu, he spent so much energy in building that he neglected the gods and did not reopen the sanctuaries. The Egyptians loathed Chephren, Khafre and Cheops Khufu so much that they really do not like to mention their names, Herodotus adds. 1. Whatever severe measures Khufu had resorted to in the building of his pyramid were repeated in the reign of his son. Khafre's own pyramid, the so-called Second Pyramid, was only 34 feet shorter than the Great Pyramid. But Khafra built it craftily on higher ground, so the casual spectator is tricked into thinking that the Second Pyramid is taller. He also left another spectacular monument, the Sphinx, a mysterious limestone sculpture, part lion and part falcon, with a man's face, probably a portrait of Khafra himself, although there is still plenty of argument over this point. The huge creature gazes to the east. It is usually referred to as a statue made from living rock, which simply means that it was carved on a piece of rock already sticking out of the ground, rather than constructed elsewhere and moved into place. The origin of the Sphinx figure itself is totally unknown. Later, the Greeks tell marvelous stories about it which had no currency at all in the 3rd millennium. Khafra may even have invented it, since the only Sphinx which may be older 41 is a small female Sphinx figure which was discovered in the ruins of his oldest son Jedefre's unfinished tomb. There is no way to know whether it dates from Jedefre's day or was tossed there later. Like the Great Pyramid, the Sphinx has attracted its share of nutty theories. It dates from 10,000 BC and was built by a disappeared advanced civilization. It was built by Atlanteans, or aliens. It represents a zodiacal sign, or a center of global energy. The elaborate explanations are totally unnecessary. The falcon was identified with Horus, while the lion was identified with the sun, and thus with the sun god, Ra, and Ra's divine colleague, Amun. This was a local god who came to be identified with Ra, sometimes as the composite god Amun-Ra. To have a statue half lion, half falcon, guarding the place where your soul would exist eternally, was to claim the protection of Egypt's most powerful gods. The name Sphinx is a Greek corruption. The original Egyptian name for the figure was probably Shesepank, or living image. 3. Possibly Khafra needed to invent a new proof of his divinity because, as Herodotus hints, the Egyptians were getting fed up with the exacting demands of their ruler. In fact, Khafra was the last builder of a huge pyramid and the last big spender of his people's energy. His son Menkaura was forced to retrench and reform. Herodotus tells us that, according to Egyptian tradition, Menkaura reopened Egypt's temples and sanctuaries, raised the people from the misery which his predecessors had inflicted on them, and ruled them kindly. Menkaura's pyramid stands as additional proof of change. The 3rd pyramid is only 228 feet tall, half the size of Khufu's. It still required vast use of resources, but nothing like the lifetime of man-hours demanded by the previous pyramids. Menkaura's relative benevolence, Herodotus explains, came from conscience. He disapproved of what his father had done. 4. Perhaps Menkaura did indeed object to the monumental architecture of his father and grandfather. However, it is just as possible that he was bowing to the inevitable. A slump in the ability of the 4th dynasty pharaohs to command the kind of obedience from the huge mass of Egyptian workers necessary to build a great pyramid. If he suspected that a revolt was on the way, a visible and public retrenching, leaning towards the merciful, was not only shrewd but unavoidable. It was also lasting. The huge 4th dynasty pyramids, which have come to represent all of Egyptian history for so many students, stand as historical curiosities in the Egyptian landscape. No later pharaoh ever topped them. Menkaure died abruptly and left the throne to his son Shepseskaf, who only managed to hold on to power for 4 years, and who didn't even raid a pyramid. He was buried in a mastaba tomb, an old-fashioned grave at the old graveyard at Saqqara, where his 3rd dynasty predecessors lay. The 4th dynasty was ended. Tyranny may have led to the dynasty's end, but there is another possible factor. Since the king was divine, he obviously needed to marry another divinity to maintain the divinity of his heirs. The royal family did not admit that any other mortal in Egypt shared in this quality, so the king's siblings were the only possible wives on offer. Following the example of his predecessors, Khafra married his half-sister, Khamene'tep I. Khamene'tep I gave birth to a son and daughter, Menkaura and Khamene'tep II. Menkaura, on ascending the throne, then married his full sister, who was also his cousin, since Khamene'tep I, by marrying her half-brother, became her own daughter's half-aunt. She also became both Menkaura's mother and his mother-in-law, a challenging role for any woman. The alert reader is probably wondering at this point why all these people didn't have 3 heads. In Europe, thousands of years later, decades of royal matches between blood relatives produced a slew of illnesses and imbecilities. Ferdinand I of Austria, whose mother was also his double first cousin once removed, liked to pack himself into a wastepaper basket and roll down the hall, and his most coherent utterance was reportedly, "I am the emperor, I want dumplings." It is possible that the genetic code was a little less fragile so long ago. There also may have been a certain self-selection going on. If you had the choice of a handful of siblings for your spouse, you were likely to pick the most vigorous and healthy, thereby perhaps avoiding damaged genes. On the other hand, the rapid fall-off of the pharaoh's power after Menkaura might hint at trouble in the royal bloodline. Statues of Menkaura himself show a slightly odd-shaped head with weirdly prominent eyes, although Menkaura himself seems to have been in full possession of his wits. However, his oldest son by his sister Khamene'tep II, Prince Quenre, lived just long enough to be proclaimed heir, and then succumbed to some unknown illness before his father's death. Menkaura himself seems to have died very suddenly, and Menkaura's second son, Shepseskaf, had an entirely undistinguished and very brief reign. There is also the peculiar survival of a story, again transmitted via Herodotus, that Menkaura fell in love with his own daughter and raped her, after which she hanged herself, in grief. Herodotus himself remarks, "But this is all nonsense in my opinion." 6, and it probably is. Given the usual cheerful incest in the Egyptian royal family, it is unlikely that an Egyptian princess would find this act as shocking as we do, and the story also says that the daughter was Menkaura's only child, which is demonstrably false. But this legend of inbreeding is the only one which survives as an explanation for the dynasty's end. The pharaohs of the 5th dynasty were not marked by a huge infusion of fresh blood. The first 5th dynasty pharaoh, Userkaf, was Menkaura's first cousin once removed. He also married his second cousin, Menkaura's daughter. Nevertheless, the breaking of the father-to-son succession also hinted at other changes. A papyrus which is probably 500 years later than Userkaf but much earlier than Manetho, chalks up the change in dynasty to a prophecy. Khufu was told that his son and grandson would rule, but that the throne would then go to 3 sons of the high priest of the sun god Ra, the priest who served at the sun god's chief temple in Heliopolis. These children, gold-skinned, would be attended at their births by the gods themselves. 7. In other words, power was shifting from the palace towards the temples. The 5th dynasty pharaohs, there were probably 9, all of them more or less undistinguished, built very small pyramids, but during this century 5 new temples were built to the sun god. The first was erected by Userkaf himself. A boat for Ra's use lies at its south edge, and it boasted in front of it an obelisk, a stone tower pointing upwards at the sky, the home of Ra. The top of the obelisk was a miniature pyramid covered in gold that glowed in the rays of the sun like a miniature sun itself. During the 5th dynasty, the pharaoh also became more closely identified with the sun god. He had been Horus and Osiris. Now he was the son of Ra. 8. This likely brought him further under the control of the sun god's high priest, who could convey to him his father's words. Instead of the earthly incarnation of a god, the king was now the son of a god, a subtle but meaningful demotion. The rings of divine power had rippled outwards, and the pharaoh was no longer the central and unquestioned conduit of it. And the idea of the pharaoh's continuing presence on earth after death had also begun to fade. During the 5th dynasty, the entire progression of the spirit after death into another world was laid out in writing for the first time. O Ra begins spell 217. This King Unas comes to you, your son comes to you. King Unas's identification with Horus and Osiris is mentioned in passing, but more attention is given to the fact that he will now ascend with Ra, rise to the sky and go up on high, there to live in the embrace of his father, the high and distant Ra. 9. When Unas left his people, he apparently did so without issue, and a brief tussle over the throne ensued. The next dynasty that came to the throne, the sixth dynasty, had an even foggier vision of its own divinity. Its pharaohs married commoners. This could have infused the royal family with new vigor and brought it back to power, but it was too late. Other blood successions had risen to challenge the power of the royal line. Over the course of 100 years or so, the governors of various Egyptian provinces, bureaucrats who had always been appointed by the crown, had seized on periods of chaos at Memphis to pass their power to their sons. 44. As a result, the first pharaoh of the sixth dynasty, Teti, now ruled an Egypt that contained, in essence, small hereditary states with their own royal families. Teti himself took as his Horus name the title Seheteptui, which means he who pacifies the two lands. 10. The startling return of the north-south hostility, something which had sunk from view beneath the surface of Egyptian unity, is only one hint of the currents now pulling at Egypt. Others are glimpsed in Manetho, who adds that Teti was assassinated by his own bodyguard. The divinity of the pharaoh had once made him untouchable, but this had now begun to fracture. Teti's successor, Pepi I, had to put down an assassination plot in his own harem. 11. His oldest son was dethroned and replaced by a 6-year-old named Pepi II, clearly a figurehead for a powerful palace faction. Pepi II is credited with a 94-year rule, the longest in Egyptian history. But rather than representing a time of stability, this century stands as one when the pharaoh ruled in name only. Noblemen, priests, and palace officials increasingly broke the kingdom apart between them. Towards the second half of Pepi II's long reign, Egypt, already practically divided into smaller kingdoms, united only by the conventional agreement that the throne in Memphis in fact governed the whole country, began to unravel in earnest. It is difficult to point to one precipitating event, but it seems almost certain that the Nile floods dropped once again, as they had towards the end of the first dynasty. The western desert seems to have been pushing at the edges of Egypt's cultivable land, an event which may have caused a certain level of panic. Documented events related to the end of the sixth dynasty are scarce. Our best source is the Egyptian king list, which, as Colin McEvedy remarks in his Atlas of the Ancient World, follows Pepi II with a downright goofy dynasty. A seventh dynasty with 70 pharaohs in 70 days. The numerical repetition must be symbolic. The number 7 didn't yet have the significance of completion that it gained later on, in the sacred writings of the Israelites. More likely, the scribes keeping the king list multiplied the number of the dynasty by 10 to demonstrate total chaos. After the wasteful fourth dynasty squandering of Egyptian lives and money, the weakness of the royal family's genes and the natural self-limiting nature of the pharaoh's divinity, drought provided the final push over the edge. For a little more than 100 years, rival dynasties would rule in different cities and Egypt would be divided between battling kings. The sixth dynasty was the last of the old kingdom of Egypt. The next 4 dynasties would belong to the disorganized time known as the First Intermediate Period. After the wasteful fourth dynasty squandering of Egyptian lives and money, the weakness of the royal family's genes, and the natural self-limiting nature of the pharaoh's divinity, drought provided the final push over the edge. For a little more than 100 years, rival dynasties would rule in different cities, and Egypt would be divided between battling kings. The first collapse of empire, the end of the Old Kingdom, was not sudden single event but a confluence of tyranny, family strains, priestly power, and ecological stress.